right, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today. Welcome again to our Lawns Legumes kickoff webinar for the spring 2024 grant season. We're really excited to have you, excited to see what pollinator planting projects you'll create. A few logistical notes first. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. We have a couple of staff members who will be monitoring and responding throughout, and then we'll save any unanswered questions for our Q&A session next week. As we get going, I just want to remind you all to stay muted throughout the duration of the presentation, just so we can hear our presenters. And we will be recording this webinar and sending it out to everyone afterwards if you do have to leave early. All right, so a quick note on who we are. Throughout the course of the grant period, you'll see that you'll be getting communications from a few different organizations, and just want to clarify who is who, because Lawns Legumes is a big program, and we do it with the help of multiple partners here. So Lawns Legumes is a program of the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, and they have contracted with Blue Thumb Planting for Clean Water to help manage this individual support program of Lawns Legumes. Blue Thumb is the education and statewide outreach arm of Metro Blooms, and Metro Blooms is a nonprofit based in South Minneapolis. So if you do see things coming from all of these names, we're all working together for the same thing here at Lawns Legumes. And to introduce ourselves, I'll go ahead and introduce myself first, and then we'll hear from our other presenters today. My name is Megan Reich. I am the Communications and Program Manager at Metro Blooms, and I help with Lawns Legumes Program Administration and Communications. And I will pass it on to Dan next.
Thanks, Megan. I'm Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. I'm a senior ecologist and have worked with the program since the beginning in 2019. I'll turn it over to Megan.
All right, Alexandra, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra Zerzan. I'm the Lawns Legumes and Special Projects Manager here with Blue Thumb Metro Blooms. I work primarily with coaches, but I'm really excited to get to work with you guys today too.
Great. And then we also have John and Jacqueline who will be helping out in our chat today. And Dan, I believe we're passing things over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Just want to thank everybody for joining today and for your interest in supporting pollinator populations. You play a really important role in the success of this program. With the Lawns Legumes program, our main goal is to build a movement to protect Minnesota's declining pollinator populations. We first had funding in 2019 through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, through the LCCMR, and more recently through the Minnesota General Fund through a legislative appropriation. The main focus of this program is to establish pollinator projects on residential landscapes across Minnesota to benefit the rusty patch bumblebee and other pollinators that are at risk. With this program, we have a focus on native plants, and there's several reasons for that, and we'll get into some of them a little bit later. One of the key reasons is that we have over 500 species of native bees in the state and many other pollinators, and they've evolved unique associations with our native plants. A good example is the monarch butterfly, which needs native milkweed species for its life cycle. And that's true with many other butterflies and moths. They have unique host plants that they need within the landscape to raise their young. Next slide, please. As ecologists, we have many concerns with biodiversity loss across the world. It's estimated that about 40% of insect species are currently in decline, and these insect species make up a base of our food webs and really support our ecosystem. So this decline is very concerning for us. Fortunately, there are many things we can do. Native insects really rely on native plants within landscapes. And so the plantings that you'll all be involved in will play a really important role in supporting these species. Next slide, please. So there's the rusty patch bumblebee is a species that we focused on with this program. This species has declined about 80% over 20 years, so a really rapid decline. That's similar for the monarch butterfly. We think it's similar for many other pollinators as well that we just don't know as much about. This species was listed as endangered in 2017, and it was listed as Minnesota's state bee in 2019. This species has many of its remaining populations in urban areas. So this is a pollinator that can really be benefited by residential plantings. And that's part of the reason we focus on this species so much with the program. Some of the needs of this bumblebee and others are nesting areas and shelter, blooming native flowers throughout the growing season, protection from chemicals, insecticides and fungicides, and connected high quality habitat to increase foraging and other needs of the species. Next slide. I mentioned there were other benefits of native plants. So one of these is that they have very deep roots. That's shown in the diagram down at the bottom. Some of these root systems of the native prairie plants are going down around 12 feet deep. That helps support soil health. It adds organic content into the soil, sequesters carbon. Those deep roots also help bring water down into the ground. So it helps increase the infiltration rates of water. And these native plants are providing food sources for pollinators, creating wildlife habitat. They're also very resilient to things like drought and extreme weather events, things that we've been experiencing from climate change. And they also add beauty to our landscapes. So with native plants, so we're focused on native plants that are found in native plant nurseries. And so we refer participants of this program to lists of native plant nurseries. So we're not funding plants that are cultivars or hybrids of native plants. Quite often these are genetically modified for aesthetic purposes or other traits, and that can lead to limited nutrition for pollinators. So with looking for cultivars or hybrids, the cultivars usually have a single quote in their name. So that's one thing that you can look for that is shown in the example on the far right side. Hybrids have an X in their name. Some of these cultivars or hybrids will also have whimsical names. And so this is where we really recommend referring to native plant nurseries because they can guide you on finding plants for this program. We also do have many species lists and planting templates for the program that have examples of plants that are eligible. Down at the lower part of this slide, there's examples of cultivars and hybrids. Gaillardia spin-top orange halo. So that's an example of a cultivar with the single quotes. Spin-top orange halo blanket flower that has the whimsical name. So that would indicate that it's likely a hybrid. And Gaillardia X grandiflora has the X indicating that it would be a hybrid. Next slide, please. The column on the left shows Minnesota native plants. So it lists the scientific name. So first, Echinacea angustifolia. Echinacea is the genus name and angustifolia is the species name for narrow leaf purple coneflower. You can see there aren't any single quotes or X's or whimsical names there. Aquilegia canadensis is the scientific name for columbine. And then ninebark is listed as well. On the right side, so there's some examples of some cultivars or hybrids there. We also list Echinacea purpurea, eastern purple coneflower. It's a plant that isn't actually native to Minnesota, so it's not one that we promote for this program. So that would be the case for any plants that aren't really native to Minnesota that we wouldn't be promoting them for the program. So again, this is where it's helpful to refer to the native plant nurseries for guidance on what plant species are native. Next slide, please. With the program, we set it up with 3 different components. When we were developing the program, we were thinking about how we could provide as much benefit to Minnesota pollinators as possible. And so we developed a education and outreach campaign as one key component to work with a network of partners across the state. So we could create and share resources to promote do-it-yourself planting projects. And there's been many of those that have been accomplished across the state with this program. Another key component is the pollinator pathways, which was previously known as demonstration neighborhoods. These are grants to local organizations to work with multiple residents within a geographic area to build pollinator corridors. So that's another component of this program. And then we have the individual resident support component of the program. This is the part that you're participating in. So this is the $400 grants. There's educational workshops and coaching involved with this part of the program. And we funded 3,000 grantees in December of this past year for this individual resident support part of the program. So there's a few requirements for the individual support grants. One is maintaining the projects at least 3 years. Also using locally adapted, local origin native plants. Avoiding use of chemicals and pesticides that may harm pollinators. And then at the end of the program, submitting before and after images, mapping your projects, and submitting receipts. There is a map on this slide, and this is a map that we use for selection of projects as part of our ranking process. The dark gray areas are showing high priority areas for the rusty patch bumblebee. You can see those are over some of the urban areas in the state. And then the green areas are showing other areas that have been prioritized by state agencies for pollinators and benefiting other wildlife species. And I think I'm turning it back over to you, Megan.
All right. Thanks, Dan. So now we're going to spend some time walking through what you need to do to complete a successful project and the types of projects that are available to you with the Launch the Legumes grant. So at this point, you've confirmed your participation. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to the planning phase. So there are 4 basic project types that are associated with Launch Legumes that you can do with your reimbursement. These include native pocket plantings, pollinator beneficial trees and shrubs, pollinator lawns, and pollinator meadows. You are welcome to do a combination of different types as well. So I'm going to give just a quick overview of each type here. So native pocket plantings are small plantings. They can come in a variety of shapes and settings. They can be as small as just a 10 by 10 foot area in your garden. They could also be a variation like a rain garden or a boulevard planting along your sidewalk or street. They could even be a buffer if you live along a lake or a river. And what's important to think about with these pocket plantings is to start small. So especially if you're new to native plant landscaping, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. Just a small 10 by 10 foot garden is a great start. And a lot of studies have even been shown by just adding a small 10 by 10 garden can help provide that habitat that pollinators need. And these are the most popular project type for our Launch Legumes grantees. So next up is our pollinator beneficial trees and shrubs. This, I believe, is our second most popular project type. Many native trees and shrubs can be a really great early spring food source for pollinators, for bees that are just coming out of hibernation. Trees and shrubs can also serve as host plants for pollinators. So for lots of moths and butterflies, their larvae rely on native trees and shrubs for nutrition. Other considerations that might lead you to choose a tree planting include some of the edible fruit that our native trees provide for both humans and wildlife, shade, autumn color, added winter interest. So again, another great project type. Pollinator lawns are also another option. This is a project type where we do allow a couple of non-native species exceptions, which we'll talk about later. A pollinator lawn could be a good project for you if you have a section of your yard that maybe does have some traffic on it. You have kids or pets that are going to use it, or you're going to recreate on it and you don't necessarily want taller plants in it. Pollinator lawns usually consist of a mix of low-growing fescue grasses and some other pollinator beneficial flowering species. And fescues in particular are quite deep-rooted compared to typical turf grass, and they actually require a very little watering and mowing once they're established. So they're good low-maintenance option as well. And then finally, we have our pollinator meadow, which is essentially a larger version of a native pocket planting. Pollinator meadows are expansive areas with a diverse array of native plant species, and
you've got water up there. I can't give it to you.
Beneficial choice for supporting as many pollinators as possible. So if you do have the time and space to create a pollinator meadow, this is a great option. They usually have a mix of grasses and flowers. And you can either start a pollinator meadow from seed, or you might even want to start with a pocket garden this spring and then gradually add to it over time to eventually create a meadow that takes up your full yard. So just to recap, we recommend selecting a project type that meets your needs for your yard while also supporting as many pollinator species as possible. And it's always better to have a smaller and successful project rather than taking on something that you'll be unable to finish or maintain. So just a bit about design. Planting a garden can be really fun because you can get creative with it. And you'll find more about design in our online resources, which we'll share about later. But essentially, design helps you communicate your intention of your planting to your neighbors, that you're trying to provide habitat for these and maybe perhaps encourage others to do it in the process. So one easy design tip is to incorporate some edging materials around your planting, like bricks or stones or fencing that helps frame your garden. Edging materials are a reimbursable expense, and we'll get into eligible expenses later as well. But you can also think about borders, paths, even things like bird baths, or just elements that help create what we call cues to care, so that people know that what you're doing is intentional. Having signs is also a good way to do that. And if you do complete your project, you'll be sent a Lawns to Legumes yard sign to your address. So that's another perk of being in the program. All right, so a big part of planning your project is choosing what native plant species you'll be including in it. And some of the keys to successfully selecting those plants is choosing ones that will thrive in the specific environmental conditions of your yard. So some basic questions you can ask is, how much sunlight is there? Do you have an area that gets mostly sun throughout the day? Or maybe you have an area that's mostly shaded and you want to do a shade garden. You can also consider your soil moisture and think about what plants do well in drier soil versus wetter soil, depending on what you have. And then the last bullet point here is really important. We would like you to try to have blooming flowers throughout the growing season. So some plants that bloom in spring, some that bloom in summer, and some that bloom in fall. And the purpose of this is to help make sure that we're supporting pollinators throughout the year, especially on that early spring and late fall tail end. It can be harder for pollinators to find the resources that they need. And you can find plant lists like the one shown here and a lot more on our resources page, which we'll walk through later. So when it comes to layout and where to put your different plants, try to go for a mixture of grasses, flowers, maybe some shrubs too. Oftentimes our native flowers can get pretty tall and they'll get a little leggy and want to flop over. So having grasses and shrubs kind of creates that structure, which can really help. You can also think about keeping your species group together because that helps it make you easier to identify them. So planting in groups of 3s or 5s, and that also makes it easier for pollinators when they're looking for the flowers that they want. You can also think about the vantage which you will view your garden from. It's nice to be able to get like a nice full array that you can enjoy from your window. So you might think about putting shorter plants in whatever the front of your garden is, the taller ones in the back. I like to think of it as kind of like arranging people for a family photo. And this design template here at the bottom right is an example of several different design templates that we have, which we'll also share later on our resources page. And now I think I'm going to pass it on to Alexandra.
Great. So once you've gone through the process of planning your project, obviously the next step, once the ground is thawed and the snow is gone, is to install your project. So we're just going to go over a couple of quick tips on that now. You can go to the next slide. First step and the most important step for the success of your project is preparing your project site. There are a number of ways you're going to do this depending on like what project you're putting in and where you're placing it in your property, but we'll kind of run through some of them now. If you're working on turf, obviously the first step is going to be to remove the sod. You can do this in a number of ways. You can do it by hand with a shovel, although that's going to take you quite a bit of time if you're working on a large scale. You can rent or borrow a manual sod kicker, which is in the photo you see on the left there. That can take a bit of work too, though. So they do have mechanized or gas-powered sod kickers or sod cutters that you can use as well that make taking sod off of a large scale a little bit easier. But once you've done that, a lot of times the soil underneath a sod covered area is really compacted. So it's going to be pretty important to also turn that soil, loosen it up a little bit. This will not only help with your digging as you go to plant your plants, but it'll also give a little bit more air and room for those root structures of your new plants to thrive. When you do this, though, you are inevitably going to be turning up a new seed bank. It could have great seeds in it. It is more likely to have weed seeds in it, though. So you will automatically, whenever you have bare soil that you've uncovered, you're going to want to make sure that you put down mulch or another weed suppression tool, like a weed suppression mat. This is just going to really help you manage those weeds and help give your garden the best chance of success for the plants that you actually put in to thrive. When you go to mulch your garden, we typically recommend using something called double shredded hardwood mulch. It can have some different names, but you can usually find it at a garden center or somewhere that you could get bulk mulch will often have it available. The really important thing about it is that it is ultimately not wood chips. The thing with chips is that they are, if you're putting in something like a rain garden, they are likely to float when the rain garden is inundated with water, and you're losing all of that mulch right away, which is unfortunate. But the other thing with the shredded mulch is that it is the like fibrous content is more likely to lock together, which just helps keep it in place, helps cover that soil a little bit more, and is a really great tool to use as you're mulching your gardens. We'll go to the next slide. There are a couple of other options for site preparation as well, even working in like a turf site. One of them is sheet mulching. Typically what this is you kind of cut down any vegetation as low as you can underneath, and then you place a layer of cardboard on top of that vegetation with either soil, compost, or mulch on top of that as well. The great thing about this is it's a little bit less like manual labor intensive. You don't have to remove all of that vegetation or soil. Everything will slowly break down over time and help add to your soil structure underneath. But there are some specific kind of rules about doing this process to make it the most successful. So you'll want to look into those a little bit further. Another one of these separate options is solarizing, which is basically covering an area in clear plastic for usually the duration of an entire growing season. Especially up here in Minnesota, we just need all of that good summertime sun possible to help cook all of the vegetation and weed seeds underneath your clear plastic to make this a really viable option. So that being said, it's typically not the best option for a short period like grant like this is, or a short period project. But if you are doing it, or if you are planning on doing it, we'd recommend just reaching out to us about potentially getting an extension so that you have enough time for this to really, really work so that your garden will be successful. With both of these methods, like I said, there's a lot of other like nuances to doing them correctly. So definitely look into them, research them a little bit. We have a couple of resources on our website, but the most comprehensive is the Xerxes Society Guide to Organic Site Preparation. It'll walk you through, what scenarios these options would be good for, and what things to consider as you're doing them. I'll go to the next slide. So you'll be working on a couple of different projects, obviously, and there are some very different tips and tricks to installing them correctly. We're not going to get into all of them now because we do have these in-depth project webinars coming up in February that will cover them more specifically, and will also be hosted by some experts in the field, which I am not. So you'll get a lot more pertinent information, but I'm going to go ahead and just give you a couple of the surface level tips that we can on some of these projects. Next slide. So if you're working on a native pocket planting, more than likely you'll be planting plugs or maybe 1 gallon size containers of plants, something like that. And a couple of things to consider. Like I said, you want to start with the site preparation first and get all of that mulch on before you do any planting. One of the reasons for this is obviously protecting against soil erosion. Another reason for this is that it'll help maintain that decompacted soil after you've raked everything and turned it. It'll just allow you to walk on your new garden without doing so much soil compaction. You'll want to lay out all of your plants. It'll help give you a good idea of your layout, make sure that all of your spacing needs are in the correct, have been correctly calculated for. And then you can go ahead and plant straight through that mulch. And what that looks like is just moving the mulch back, planting your plant to the depth of the soil, like the top of your plant should be at soil level, and then moving that mulch kind of gently back in around your plants. Again, we'll be doing way more in-depth information on this, so I'll save more tips for that next webinar. But we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. When you're working with trees and shrubs, there are some really specific rules to help you successfully plant a tree that a lot of people maybe don't consider. And so we just want to hit on some of those now. First and foremost, you want to make sure that your hole is deep enough and wide enough. You might be working with trees in containers. You might be working with trees that have been grown as bare roots, and so they have no soil around them. They were grown in a gravel bed. Either way, you want to make sure that you're digging your hole wide enough to account for all of that root structure that's already there. The next most important thing is when you're working with containerized trees, they have been oftentimes grown in those pots and will get roots that encircle the tree. And if they continue to grow in that circle, can strangle your tree, which is so sad to watch. And it's a really slow, painful death, something sad to behold. So the first thing that you want to do before you plant them is you're going to want to cut off, doing something called a box cut on your tree to basically turn that circle into a square where you've cut off all of those encircling roots, and it gives your roots now a chance to grow straight out into this new soil medium that they're being planted in. You want to make sure that your hole is deep enough. You're going to plant your tree such that the root flare, which is where the tree goes like boop, is still visible above the soil. And then you're going to gently backfill, making sure that you're clearing out any air pockets and watering that as you go. You'll also be want to mulch around your trees, but note that you don't want to make a volcano. You don't want any of that mulch touching the bark. You want to think about making more of a donut. So a nice thick layer of mulch around the tree, but a little donut hole where the trunk comes through. We'll go to the next slide. Pollinator lawns, there are a couple of different ways that pollinator lawns can be done and a couple of considerations to take in. The main one being the current weed pressure state in your lawn. If there is a lot of weed pressure, you're probably going to have to do some more intensive work to successfully establish a pollinator lawn. If you have a very healthy lawn and you're looking at doing an overseeding project, these steps are kind of what you would be looking at. So you will mow the lawn as short as possible, and maybe there's a little mower animation that will happen. And then once you have done that, there we go, you'll cut it as short as you can. You'll want to rake all of the clippings back so that you've exposed as much soil as possible. And then you're going to go back through and do the seeding. That can be done with like hand broadcasting or with a seed broadcaster. I think next slide. There we go. We'll get into spreading the seed. You can spread it with sand, compost as a good bulking agent. But otherwise, the next most important step once that seed is down is you want to keep the seed and your new lawn moist while the seed is sprouting. This is the trickiest step, I think, for a lot of pollinator lawn establishment. And James Wolfen will go into this a lot in our pollinator lawn webinar, but I'm just here to get this like first hound into you. You want to keep it moist, and that's super important. Once it establishes, you'll start changing your mowing habits. You'll be able to change your watering habits. But again, we'll cover this in more detail at a later time. Maybe the seeds will be spread when we hit this again, and they might even start to sprout. Oh, look at that, lovely. You can go to the next slide. Okay, the last project type here, the pollinator meadow. Biggest thing to note with a pollinator meadow is it is a big project to tackle. And depending on your equipment setup, you might be looking at doing this in a couple of different ways. If you have access to machinery that can, prep your soil and do the seeding on a large acreage site, by all means, do it that way if you feel like you could fit it into the grant project timeline. If you are looking at turning your own personal yard into a pollinator meadow, you might want to think about taking it in little steps, like Megan said, kind of planting a small pollinator pocket planting this spring, and then adding another pollinator planting right next to it this fall. If you keep doing that every growing season, you'll start to see the meadow come to life. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. You've got your project in the ground, you want to take a break. I'm sorry to say, maintenance starts right away as soon as you've got one of these new garden projects in, but you don't need to be super overwhelmed by maintaining these projects. There are some things that you can do to make sure that you are maintaining as you go. First thing to note with native plants, they still need water, especially during their establishment period. So they may get to the point in 3 years when they're fully grown that they don't need any supplemental water, or they can make it through drought periods with very little watering on your part. But during this first year, you're going to want to make sure that they're getting an inch of water per week after you've planted them. You can put out like a little rain gauge or even a tin can with a little 1-inch mark on it and kind of monitor that. Sometimes you get enough rain to hit that mark and you don't need to do any supplemental watering. But when you do, it's often best to think about watering longer, less often, so that the water can penetrate deeper into the soil and encourage those deeper root growth to happen. Weeding is always the bane of gardeners' existence, right? Like it's a never-ending task, but an important thing to note is that you always want to get weeds while they're small. So the more often you can get out into your garden, monitor for weeds and control them, the better. You'll become way more familiar with the plants in your garden as you start to identify what are weeds and what did I plant here. And you'll be able to watch things grow. You'll be much closer to pollinators as they're visiting. So it can be a fun time. Weeding can be fun. But I want you to know that all of the pictures here on the bottom are of the same species. You do not want to have to deal with removing that full-grown Siberian elm as a tree. You want to get it as a little tiny sapling when it's the easiest to clear. So think about getting into your garden every day, every week, setting aside 15 minutes. That'll really help. If you maybe don't have that time or that feels too overwhelming right now, our recommendation is really to think about getting out around the 3 big summer holidays, so Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day. The reason we say that is because weeds, different weed species have different growing patterns. We have cool season weeds that will start to come up in the spring, and you will be able to get that flush out with the Memorial Day weeding. Then we have weeds that start to grow through in the summer. They need that heat, and you'll be able to get them cut back in the midsummer and then again at Labor Day. Keeping your plantings clear of debris is obviously something we all, I think, strive for. We don't want our new gardens to be filled with garbage, but it's incredibly important if you're putting in a rain garden, for the functionality of the rain garden, that you're making sure it's clean and clear. As you're getting out into your garden more often and as it continues to establish, probably not this year, but maybe next year, you might find some places where you need to replace some mulch. You might find out that a plant species you put in really just didn't thrive where it was, and it either needs to be replaced with the same species, or you might need to try something new. So you just want to make sure that you're kind of keeping tabs on your garden as you go. Next slide. Back to you, Megan.
All right, thanks, Alexandra. So now we are going to cover some resources that you can use to help you with your project. So we have a variety of online resources available on bluethumb.org, and I'm going to highlight just a few and some of the key places you can go to. So the first one is our resources page. You'll see here a screenshot of that page and how you can navigate to it. It's under the Learn tab. And this is really your central hub for plant lists, design templates, and project guides. You can explore the tabs to find resources relevant to your specific project. And most of these are downloadable PDFs, so feel free to save them, print them, share them as you like. I want to highlight in particular the Planting for Pollinators Design Guide, which was made by the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources specifically for lawns, legumes, grantees, and it covers step-by-step planting and installation advice for each of the 4 project types. So that's a great place to go to if you're looking for some more in-depth guidance. And in addition to the resources page, the main page on our website that will be most helpful for you as a grantee is our grantee guide. This is where the recording of this webinar will be posted, and this page includes important info on deadlines and requirements for submitting your project for reimbursement. So when in doubt, check the grantee guide first for answers to your questions. There's also a pretty comprehensive FAQ at the bottom of this page. One resource to call out on the grantee guide is a directory we've pulled together of some native plant nurseries and retailers throughout Minnesota where you can buy your project's materials. You're not limited to having to buy plants from those on this list, but these are all trusted locations with knowledgeable staff who can help you buy native plants and other reimbursable expenses. And then if you are interested in taking your learning to the next level, you can sign up for our free Resilient Yards online learning series. This contains some extra videos and guidance on pollinator-friendly practices, as well as clean water practices like rain gardens. And then Blue Thumb also will be putting on a number of in-person and virtual live workshops this spring. And there is a small registration fee for that, but that fee is a reimbursable expense. The Resilient Yards workshop in particular is a great opportunity to talk with a landscape designer one-on-one about your project plans, and the registration for those workshops will open in early spring, probably around late February. All of you as grantees have access to the Hive as well, which is our online community forum. This is a place where you can ask questions for coaches, staff, and each other. We'll also be putting program updates in there. And it's a great place to just get to know your fellow Lawns to Legumes grantees. I believe you were emailed a link to join the Hive in the email that you got after you filled out the confirmation form. And it was also in the newsletter that was sent out on Tuesday. And we'll continue to share it in our emails as well to make sure that you get that link. Okay, so after you've successfully completed your project, the next step is going to be to submit a reimbursement request. So we're going to go over what you'll need. You can access the reimbursement page from the Lawns Legumes drop-down menu on the Blue Thumb website. The reimbursement form is closed, but it'll open in May when people are starting to do projects. So there's 4 main things that you'll need to submit your reimbursement request. The first is receipts, so proof of the purchases that you made that you'd like reimbursement for. Before and after photos of your project, just knowledge of the number of hours that you spent on your project and the total amount that you spent on your project, even if that goes above the $400 reimbursable amount, just for our recording and tracking purposes. And then we'd also like to know the size of your project. So a key document that you'll be wanting to refer to throughout the grant period is our eligible expenses guide. Lawns Legumes can only reimburse eligible purchases. So the main things that these include are native plants, trees, shrubs, or bee lawn seed. And then things to support your planting, including mulch, compost, edging. We do reimburse delivery fees. We also reimburse contractor installation fees or equipment rental. And then if you're doing a container planting or a project in a raised bed, I know we have a lot of renters who do those projects, or if you live in an area where you don't have a lot of yard space, we can reimburse soil or planters for those projects only. I highly recommend that you go ahead and check out the full guide on the Grantee guide, just to see some of the details. There's a few other things like if you don't have any garden tools, we can reimburse that as well. And then again, just a reminder, take note that you'll need to keep track of your either physical or digital receipts of all your purchases. And for this spring grant period, we can only reimburse purchases that were made after the date that you received your award, which was December 15 of last year. So here are some examples of what your receipt will hopefully have. And ideally, if you can find a receipt that's itemized, so it shows each item that you purchased and shows the name of what you purchased. We'd also like to see key details on it, like the date that you purchased it, where you purchased it from. Our team does review each and every receipt. So if it's not readable, we unfortunately won't be able to reimburse you for the purchases on it. If you are submitting a receipt that has purchases that weren't part of your project, you can just go ahead and circle or highlight the specific things that you are requesting reimbursement for as part of your project. If you end up with a receipt that is either not itemized or does not include the specific names of the plants that you purchased, what you can do is there's a spot where you can submit just a list of the plant names that went with your receipts, or you can submit a photo of your plant tags. That can also work. So again, the eligible expenses guide has all of these details and more. If you aren't sure about whether a specific expense is eligible for reimbursement, you can always email the L2L helpline, or you can ask your question in the Hive. Our staff also check the Hive regularly for questions. So moving on to before and after pictures. All we need is just at least 1 or 2 before and 1 after. If you can take them from far away enough to just establish some context of where it is in your yard, that's great. Close-up photos aren't as useful for us. Try to take your photos from the same general location and vantage point between your before and after, just so they're comparable. And don't worry if your new planting looks a little rough or it might not be quote beautiful yet. These photos are just to help us see that you completed your project and that all the components that you're asking for reimbursement for were applied to your project. So you'll also be sharing the amount of time that you spent on your project, as well as the total amount you spent on your project. For the spending, I would just recommend that you keep track of your expenses as you go. You might want to have like a list or an Excel spreadsheet that you keep, and just so that when it's time to reimburse at the end, you're not having to scramble to pull together all your receipts. And then for time, the requirement is pretty easy to fulfill. It's a minimum of 2 hours of time spent on your projects to receive reimbursement. And this does include the time that you're spending right now watching the kickoff webinar, as well as planning time. And there'll be a spot where you'll be able to record the total number of hours that you spent on your project. I'm going to pass it over to Alexandra now, who will review our timeline.
Yes, so looking at the whole grant period now, obviously you were all notified of your award back on December 15th. You've accepted. We're really excited for you to get started. Next Wednesday, January 24th, at the same lunchtime hour from 12 to 1, we'll be hosting an optional Q&A session that will be recorded and sent out to anyone who is unable to attend. We will then be hosting our project specific webinars that I had mentioned before, where we'll go into a lot more detail. The first one being on February 20th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. is our pollinator plantings webinar. That's going to be hosted by a couple of our designers at Metro Blooms Design and Build, and they will have some really, really excellent knowledge to share with you on how to do some of these plantings successfully. There will also be time at the end of those for some Q&A that's built in as well. February 29th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. So in the evening, we'll have that Pollinator Lawns webinar hosted by James Wolfen from Twin City Seed. Again, saving some time for Q&A for anyone that has that'll be done during that webinar. Both of those will be recorded and shared with everyone as well. So you'll be able to access that later if you can attend. Also, if you need to reference it later as you're going through planning, it'll be there for you. We do match grantees with coaches, and we'll be getting into some of the details of that in just a moment here. But I want to say that anyone who does get matched with a coach, those assignments will be sent to coaches February 9th, and then you can expect to hear from coaches in the following couple of weeks. You can start obviously planning now, thinking about visiting any native nurseries or looking at seed catalogs online. That's something you can be doing now through May. In-person shopping obviously typically doesn't start until a little bit later in the spring, but if you are planning on going to a nursery or even attending plant sales, all of those are viable options for purchasing plants, and we'll be sharing some plant sales that we hear about in the Hive if you're ever curious about what's kind of on the agenda. Planting season for the state of Minnesota obviously varies pretty widely from the south to the north, but as a general rule of thumb, we typically say you shouldn't be putting plants in the ground until after Mother's Day. That's usually when we can call it safe, but obviously this year has been kind of weird and warm, so that could change. Just know that you want to be paying attention to what's going to be the healthiest for your plants. July 15th, though, is our hard project deadline. You will want to have all of your reimbursement requests and supporting documents submitted to us so that we can process those reimbursements and get them sent out to you. And then following your reimbursement submission, we will separately be sending out Lawns to Legumes yard signs for everyone to post in your garden and show your neighbors what you've worked on. I will just add a little caveat. That is a separate process for us to ship those, so it can take a little bit of time. So if you get your reimbursement back saying like you're good to go, it might take a little while for you to get that sign, but it's on its way. Next slide. A little bit more in detail about this Q&A session. So we will be taking all of the questions that you've asked in the chat today, especially some of the most common ones that have maybe come up more than once, and we will be answering them at next week's Q&A session. If you are processing all of this information later and come up with a question that you want answered, or if you're watching the recording, hello, you can send an email to us at the L2L helpline, and we will add those questions to our list to get to in next week's webinar as well. The link for that Zoom will be sent out again, I believe, but it should also have been sent out in the newsletter as well. It will be recorded. We'll share that again with everyone afterwards. Next slide. So a little bit more into coaching. So we are really, really fortunate to work with many volunteer coaches across the state who are in different organizations, Master Gardeners, Minnesota Water Stewards, Master Naturalists. Also, a lot of them are volunteers who have previously completed a Lawns to Legumes project, and they were so excited about it and loved it so much, they want to help you now do it too. So they have already been signing up, letting me know what their interest is and capacity for taking on grantees is. After this webinar, we will be emailing out an L2L support survey. Basically, this will have some questions where you can express your interest in being matched with a coach, and then it will also tell us a little bit about you, your experience with gardening, if you have another grant that you're kind of partnering with on this project, some things like that. I really want to highlight that a couple of things. One, our coaches are volunteers. They're amazing volunteers, but they have a limited amount of time. So when you do get matched with a coach, you typically can expect to work with them for maybe a couple of hours over the course of your whole grant period. They typically do most of their coaching virtually. So a lot of the times what that would look like is you might do a video call or even a telephone call with your coach during these planning phases for a little bit longer, like an hour or more, depending on what your availability is. And then you can follow up with your coach throughout the grant season after that as you come up with more questions. The other thing I want to highlight with our coaches is that we always have more requests for coaches than we are able to fill. So we do our best to match as many grantees and coaches as possible. We typically will try and prioritize grantees who don't have as much gardening experience, just so you can get the most out of that connection with a coach. But as Megan already went over, we have a lot of other resources. So if you don't get matched with a coach and you have other questions, highly encourage you to use the L2L helpline, reach out in the Hive. We have coaches who are in there answering questions, as well as staff who can help with some of those if you are unfortunately not matched with a coach. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide, which I jumped the gun a little bit here. So yes, at any point, if you have a question, remember these 3 places to go to get help. Number 1, the grantee guide and that frequently asked questions section at the bottom. It's a really comprehensive guide. We always add more frequently asked questions that we get into this space so that you can learn from things other people have wondered about as well. If you're not finding information there, check out the Hive, ask your questions. Again, as coaches and staff, we're excited to be in there and helping you, but we also know that many of you are experienced gardeners and might be willing to share some of your tips and tricks with fellow grantees. So that's a really great place to get some conversation started. And then finally, the L2L helpline, you can email us at any time throughout the grant period, and we're happy to help there. Next slide is our last slide. Thank you so much to everyone for coming today, for taking the time out of your day to learn with us and to prepare yourself better for this grant period. Again, we've got some questions that we were answering in the chat. Thank you, John and Jacqueline, for doing that. We'll be saving the rest of them to answer next week. We'll be sending out the recording later. Dan, Megan, do you have anything else that you want to add today?
No, I think that covers it, Alexandra. Yeah, tomorrow we'll be sending an email with the recording, and I'll also include in there a link to the Hive. Again, I know some people asked for that.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for your involvement with the program.
We're very excited to see what you plant this spring. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.